Hello, and welcome to our Sunday Thoughts at Cork Unitarian Church. Today, I'll be reflecting on some of our various ideas about beliefs, both in terms of church and also our own personal lives. Beliefs are very powerful. They can help us persevere, endure, and even excel. They can also transform our desires and fears into our own personal truths. That may be good or bad. As many of you probably know, Unitarians are not all that big on standardized religious beliefs. Unitarians don't have creeds, and beliefs are left to be the personal matters of individual church members. I'll share with you right up front that I personally dislike beliefs because they are often an intellectual and spiritual straitjacket. Once I know something is true, then the case is closed. That bit of knowledge in me becomes a fact that is hardened like a diamond. It's no longer subject to change, even as the world around continues to change. In my personal experience, that is a much too brittle way to live. Let me take an example from Christian tradition to illustrate how this might apply in religion. And I'm not taking this to poke fun at Christian tradition. Rather, Christian tradition is an important part of our Western cultural heritage, and that's why I chose it. Also, I chose this example because it's one that you're at least likely to have heard of or be a bit familiar with. So in chapter 19 of Matthew's Gospel, a young man comes up to Jesus and asks him how to get to heaven. Jesus responds, but in that response, Jesus does not tell the lad what to believe. He tells the lad what to do. It's not about believing, it's about doing. He tells him to keep the commandments, obey the law, and to be charitable to people in need. That is all about doing. That solution is in contrast to Paul's letter to the Galatians, where Paul's solution to the question of being saved is a belief. And that belief for Paul is having faith in Jesus' death and resurrection. Those are two very different approaches. Was Jesus right? Or Paul? Who knows? My own personal preference and logic would side with Jesus in this regard and not advise over-reliance on faith. Now, in all fairness, historically speaking, Paul did not live long enough to have been able to read Matthew's Gospel. So Paul might have been unfamiliar with some or even many of Jesus' actual teachings. Certainly, this seems to have been the case, as Paul seldom actually wrote about any of Jesus' teachings. Perhaps even more oddly enough, among Christians today, Jesus does not seem to automatically outrank Paul in regard to the matter in question here. Christians have never come to agreement of what and how much to believe. Some leaning more towards preferring Paul's Galatians idea, and some being more attracted to Jesus' ideas as captured by Matthew. I think it's all good and fine that various Christians have different beliefs. And I also think it is fine and good when Christians and non-Christians have different beliefs. And when everyone is good with that, then things are fine. However, there are other times when one group thinks less of the other group because of their beliefs. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about beliefs that have to do with the kindness to or mistreating of other people. On those beliefs, we should take issue. What I'm talking about instead are the beliefs that have to do with the nature of God. Beliefs that cannot be objectively proven. The problem arises when those kind of beliefs that cannot be negotiated become the criteria for acceptance or rejection of a person. Certainly, the problem arising from such conflicts has been seen often in Irish history. Now, part of the problem with beliefs is they attract other beliefs, kind of the way the hull of a ship in the ocean attracts barnacles. And in order to protect an absolute belief, we often pile on additional beliefs until we have a whole system of ancillary beliefs. We can probably see contemporary examples of this with people who believe in a flat earth or who believe in creationism. In order to support their core belief, they must eventually incorporate a whole range of complex supporting beliefs. This phenomena of piling up beliefs was actually addressed by a 14th century Franciscan friar named William of Ockham. Now, Brother William developed an important part of the modern scientific method called the law of parsimony, often referred to today as Occam's razor, because it cuts through the baloney. Simply put, Occam's razor postulates that given multiple explanations which appear valid, the simpler explanation is always the best. So why would I want to have many beliefs that require extensive rationalization with more supporting beliefs behind them? I don't want to, and I don't think I would want to. What benefits could come from that burden? But we actually do need beliefs, don't we? At least sometimes. Beliefs help provide us with a sense of identity. They help provide us with an understanding of causality, a sense of meaning and purpose, and a basis for hope. In my observation, part of the difficulty comes when we begin to deify our beliefs and see them as inalienable and immutable truths. But we don't have to try to make everything into a fact-based belief. We can save room in our psyche for the probable, the more likely than not, the I wish it were that way, the it's easier for me to think that. Sometimes when I say I believe, I'm evaluating my perceptions and opinions. I'm elevating them to the level of a fact, an absolute truth. And often when I'm elevating, what I'm elevating is not even my own perception or opinion, but rather it's one that was given to me by some so-called authority. Yet, perceptions and opinions are by their very nature inherently relative and subjective, not absolute. There are many times when we say the words, I believe, where it would be more accurate and productive to say, I feel, or I think. Using those more appropriate words to describe our emotional and intellectual state or predisposition can be a good thing. Sometimes we might want to believe something aspirational that combines our thoughts and feelings. So in those situations, we could rightly say something like, I hope that, or I'd like to think that, instead of I believe. There can be situations where pragmatism calls for something other than absolute belief. For example, there are times when I can simply choose to hold a contextually appropriate working assumption. For example, I'll accept that premise for now. There are even times when I can play devil's advocate to myself. For example, yes, but what if I'm wrong? I can just choose to follow someone else's position. For example, Okay, for the sake of argument. So, maybe when we expand our way of thinking and talking about the way things are, we might find that we actually have less need for beliefs because all along what we have been doing is confusing beliefs with feelings, thoughts, aspirations, working assumptions, best guesses, and going along with the crowd. Now for our blessing. May we be free from beliefs that imprison us or abuse others. May we be able to distinguish between what is, what may be, what ought to be, and what has to be. May we know ourselves well enough not to confuse our feelings, desires, and predilections so as to treat them as absolutes. May we be willing to accept the limits of uncertainty and contextual relativity without trying to force ourselves into the constraints of unnecessary beliefs. Amen. And until next time, I wish all of you peace and blessings.